Boy. That the sun was directly overhead, and you see the bottom of the planet. Oh, okay. How can we use this observation to see if Earth's surface is curved? We need another well. Turns out we can't see the bottom of both wells at the same time. What might explain this? It was two possible explanations. First, it was a flat well. Or second, we could have a curved well. We saw that far ahead, so all the light comes in parallel. Only one well at a time, as with all the way to the bottom. For his next supposed proof, Neil brings us Eratosthenes, who noted that at noon during the summer solstice in Syria, the sun cast no shadow, and the rays could reach straight to the bottom of its well. Yet meanwhile, in Alexandria, a vertically extended metal rod cast a significant shadow. By factoring the length of the shadow with its assumed distance to the sun, Eratosthenes recorded a measurement of Earth's circumference close to what heliocentrist astronomers still use today. The fact of the matter is, however, that Eratosthenes' calculations were made assuming the sun could be millions of miles away, so that its rays would fall perfectly parallel, even in points as divergent as Sidon and Alexandria. This faulty assumed premise led to his faulty conclusion, which was eventually exposed upon the invention of the nautical calculus. Using sextants and plane trigonometry, by measuring the sun's angle at 2 points on Earth simultaneously and factoring their distance from each other, the Pythagorean theorem revealed both the height and dimensions of the sun. Using this method, the sun and moon have repeatedly been calculated to be approximately 32 miles in diameter, 3,000 miles from the surface of the Earth. High-altitude balloon footage has also filmed lighting hotspots on clouds, proving the sun to be local and acting as a spotlight, and not a burning ball of gas millions of miles away, as supposed by heliocentrists. After Eratosthenes, the globe-Earth theory completely disappeared from philosophical thought and recorded history for 2 millennia. Geocentric flat Earth cosmology continued to reign supreme, with even Eratosthenes himself touted as the father of geography, depicting the Earth as flat in his famous 194 BC map of the world. The last thing we should be obvious is that if we pay attention to the we just send a ship straight to the horizon. Eventually, it begins to disappear until it's no longer visible beyond your horizon. And you should ask yourself, what kind of surface would produce that result? Even if it's on post-memory, seafaring views. And so, without a flat image, imagine the Earth to be. They couldn't accept it completely flat, because otherwise you'd never not see it. Okay. His next argument, just like the previous two, comes from ancient Greek philosophers who have been debunked since the time they were presented even reacted. The fact that NASA's top modern globe crews are still simply regurgitating long-refuted claims from over 2,000 years ago should raise some suspicion. The fact of the matter is that the law of perspective on plane surfaces dictates and necessitates this occurrence. For example, a girl wearing a dress walking away towards the horizon will appear to sink into the earth the farther away she walks. Her feet will disappear from view first, and the distance between the ground and the bottom of her dress will gradually diminish until after about half a mile it seems like her dress is touching the ground as she walks on invisible land. The same happens with cars speeding away. The axles gradually get lower, and the wheels vanish until it appears as if the car is gliding along its body. Such is the case on plane surfaces. The lowest points of objects receding from a given point of observation necessarily disappear before the highest. Now, with modern telescopes and cameras, we can prove this as well by successfully zooming in on ships that have gone beyond the horizon and bringing them completely back into full view, hull and all.
You can see if you go up onto a full tower or a hill and you see more over the horizon.
Rising in altitude always allows an observer to see further regardless of the shape of the ground beneath them. This is also part of the law of perspective on plane surfaces, but you just showed with your last point that you fail to understand perspective, So it is no surprise that you also believe seeing further to the horizon when rising in altitude somehow means you live on a sphere. Whether you look over a sphere, a cylinder, a triangle, or a flat motionless earth, rising in altitude will always allow the observer to see further. This is an undeniable fact, and acting like this only happens on a globe is either disgustingly dishonest or incredibly ignorant.
Also, I just tell you, Chuck, what do you see? Okay, right. And go ahead, stop. Yeah. I sure I'm sure this is where this is going to expect and I'll be about no goal. I know our stuff and how long it takes to run there. There is a popular myth taught to school children, which most adults today still believe, that people in history have traveled in perfectly straight lines eastwards or westwards and eventually arrived back at their starting point. It is heralded as proof of the globe Earth and claims that hundreds of adventurers since Magellan have completed such successful circumnavigations. But the truth is, no one in history has ever set off traveling in a perfectly straight line and returned back at their starting point. All successful circumnavigations in history, whether by sea or air, have instead followed the same pattern, which is sailing or flying the most convenient route from port to port, stopping for supplies and refueling until a complete circle has been made. Not a single sailor or aviator in history has or could travel only in the same one perfectly straight direction and magically arrive back within a year. This ridiculous lie becomes obvious when critically examined, but when taught to young children, successfully bends and warps their minds into accepting globe indoctrination. Unlike the cardinal directions of the compass rose, north, south, east, and west on Earth are not simply straight lines separated by 90 degrees. North, rather than being an upward shooting arrow, is actually a point, a center point, the center point of the entire Earth, known as the geographic North Pole, situated directly below Polaris, the North Pole star, the only motionless star in the heavens, which marks the exact northern center point of the sky. South, rather than being a downward shooting arrow, is actually every line tangent to the northern center point, or in other words, every straight line extending outwards from the North Pole, hence due south. East and west, rather than being right and left facing arrows, are actually clockwise and counterclockwise circles around the pole. The sun, moon, and stars all rise in the east and set in the west, making perfect circles over and around us every day. As you can observe, they travel in a circular westward path over and around the Earth, and do not all travel in a straight leftward direction as suggested by a compass rose. Likewise, navigators since ancient times have used Polaris to guide their ships, knowing that Polaris was the heavenly North Pole. South was traveling keeping your back to Polaris. East meant traveling keeping your left shoulder 90 degrees to the pole star, and west meant traveling keeping your right shoulder 90 degrees to the pole star. All circumnavigations in history have been eastwards or westwards, and never northwards or southwards, because the latter is geographically impossible.
Thank you for letting that, yeah, because let me back to the thought. Well, how thick do you get any kind of testing?
These are also questions you should be asking of your spinning baller, Dr. Clark. How much thickness does your ball actually have? Wikipedia and every elementary school textbook will claim the globe is nearly 4,000 miles to the center, where there exists the alleged source of magnetism in their model, a hypothetical molten magnetic core in the center of the ball, which they claim conveniently causes both poles to constantly move, thus evading independent verification at their two ceremonial poles. In reality, the deepest drilling operation in history, the Russian Kola Superdeep, after decades of work and dozens of broken drills, managed to get only 8 miles down. So the entire ball earth model taught in schools, showing crust, outer mantle, inner mantle, outer core, and inner core layers, are all purely speculation, as we have never even penetrated through beyond the crust. So regardless of the shape of the earth, no People like Dr. Clark would rather scoff at flat earthers for not simply believing pictures in textbooks like these without empirical proof.
Everything you got an edge, but looking forward to it.
You've got an edge? You, Dr. Clark, have got an edge on your silly strawman spinning flat circle image, but not a single legitimate flat earther claims there to be an edge. Thanks to the Antarctic Treaty, signed by over 50 countries, it is impossible to independently explore the southern perimeter of Earth to find out how the Antarctic ice terminates. No genuine flat earther knows or claims to know such things, but again, globe minions like Dr. Clark are so convinced of their own strongman arguments that it's clear they have never taken the time to research what real flat earthers actually claim.
So, how do you get a flat and make what do you actually do in the dark and make it off the edge?
Again, nothing is falling off the end of your sleeve, but when it comes to the effects of so-called gravity, they are easily explained.
Quite simply, objects fall or rise based on their relative density to the medium surrounding them. Apples fall because they are denser than the air, while helium balloons rise because they are lighter. No gravity in the center. This is why raindrops fall down through the air, and air bubbles rise up through water. Everything seeks its relative density and rises or falls until settling accordingly. This is why a tiny pebble sinks to the bottom of the ocean, but gigantic cruise ships and aircraft carriers stay afloat on the surface. Because even though a pebble is so small, its mass relative to its volume, its density, is more than water, so it sinks. And even though a cruise ship is so large, its mass relative to its volume is less than water, so it floats. If Newton's apple had landed in a puddle instead of on his head, he would have seen the apple only fell through the air because it was denser in the air, but then floated on top of the water because it was less dense than water. Have you ever noticed how it's easier to stay afloat with your lungs full of air than it is when you're empty? Submarines float on the surface when their ballast tanks are filled with air, but when the vents are opened and seawater floods in, they begin to sink as the submarine's density becomes greater than water. Depending what depth they wish to dive, sailors simply adjust the ratio of air and water in their tanks, and when ready to resurface, they blow compressed air into the tank, forcing the seawater out, lowering the density, and thus causing them to rise back to the surface. We can also prove this fact of relative density by filling a balloon with approximately half helium and half air. Since helium is lighter than the oxygen, nitrogen, and other gases that compose the air around it, filling a balloon with just the right amount of helium to compensate for and balance out the density of the plastic results in a gravity-defying, levitating balloon at equilibrium that neither rises nor falls.
Now, how do you do that? You think about it, it's not like you know,
The flat motionless Earth is not only possible, it's actual. What is impossible, however, is making that fact known to people who so thoroughly believe the very law at first presented to them that they cannot open their minds enough to be that question.
for me, the fact that there's a rise gravity is evidence of two things. Okay, number one, you live in a country that protects free speech. That's actually kind of awesome. And two, we live in a country with the education system in America. There's one thing you and I agree on. It is that our public education system is indeed a complete failure, brainwashing vulnerable, impressionable young children with mentally and spiritually damaging pseudoscientific indoctrination. The widespread belief that humans are merely evolved apes clinging to a spinning space ball hurtling around the sun is proof of this. The modern rise of geocentric level Earth cosmology is a direct response and reaction to humanity finally collectively waking up after centuries of uncontested lies and propaganda.
the lead up to these talks, we've had, especially President of Brazil, Lula Silva, he made a 40-minute call to Vladimir Putin directly after major tariffs were hit on Brazil. And I just want to play a video of his remarks in recent days regarding not only how BRICS should respond, but also what BRICS is going to be doing concretely to respond to Donald Trump's very aggressive economic war. Here we go. So we can discuss within BRICS the need for trade currency among us in BRICS, and then do you back down? No, I don't back down because we need to test it. If it fails, then I was wrong. But someone would have to convince me I was wrong. So he's talking about the dollar. And then he says he's been speaking to everybody from Brazil, from China, Russia, even Europe. And he's going to actually he's going to say that he's going to hold, together with BRICS, a teleconference that's going to discuss what BRICS can do about not only improving the relations among all countries, but how they are affected by Trump and U.S. economic war. So Ben, let's begin with this. How has Donald Trump's and U.S.'s overall economic war on BRICS, how has it backfired? Because U.S. dollar started off the year in free fall the first 6 months. It's in the worst shape in terms of its value to basket of currency since 1973. And I think you're a student of economics, Ben. You know what happened in 1973. There was a major economic crisis. So talk about overall how all of this is backfired right now.
Yeah, you raised so many interesting points, and there are so many ways we could go at this discussion. I'll mention a few of the effects in brief as a summary, and then I'll go into more detail. So, in short, what Donald Trump is doing is he's accelerating the decline.
Turn the light on.
Which is something that we've seen declining over decades, with China in particular, but also Russia and Iran and India. But Trump is just putting the pedal to the metal, accelerating this. He's also accelerating de-dollarization, which is ironic, because Trump has constantly threatened countries that try to de-dollarize and try to seek alternatives to the U.S. dollar. But the more that he imposes sanctions and tariffs on countries around the world, the more he encourages them to seek alternatives to the U.S. dollar. And this is why BRICS is trying to create new mechanisms for trade in their local currencies. They're investing in gold and other assets. And central banks around the world are dumping U.S. treasuries and buying gold. So that's also what Trump is doing. And he, ironically, the more he attacks BRICS, he's actually strengthening BRICS and making it clear why BRICS is so important, including among the weakest links within BRICS, like India. Now, India's current leader, Narendra Modi, the prime minister from the right-wing Hindu Nationalist Party, BJP, he was not one of the co-founders of BRICS. It was a predecessor from the center-left centrist Indian National Congress Party that has its roots in the anti-colonial struggle, going back to Nehru. So, they still had this kind of, even though the Congress Party in India has moved away from those anti-colonial roots in a big way and took a neoliberal turn, they have their roots in that kind of anti-colonial third world nationalist tradition. They were the ones who joined BRICS. And then when Modi came in, Modi was the most pro-U.S. leader in India's history. But now even Modi, because of Trump's aggressive policy against India, even Modi is being forced to move closer to China. And India and Russia have always had very good relations. So Trump is doing everything he can, ironically, to accelerate these efforts to improve relations between India and China after for years U.S. presidents have tried to make a schism, a split in between India and China, and exacerbate those relations. And then now, of course, we have this Alaska meeting between Trump and Putin. Trump has been saying for months that he's going to try to divide China and Russia. He said in October in an interview with Tucker Carlson that he was convinced that he could divide China and Russia. Well, actually, all of these policies have only further encouraged China and Russia to get closer together, while China and India are moving closer together. China and Russia now have completely de-dollarized their trade. Over 95% of bilateral trade between China and Russia is in their national currencies, the renminbi or yuan, and the Russian ruble. So we also see that China's President Xi Jinping took a trip to Moscow to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the defeat of fascism in World War II. And China and Russia released an extremely long joint statement, over 8,000 words when translated into English. And in that joint statement, they made it clear. They said, third parties will not influence our relations. They emphasized that Beijing and Moscow may have the closest relations they've ever had in history. And they said the U.S. cannot divide them. So everything that Trump says he wants to do is failing. It's actually backfiring. And what this shows, I mean, I always emphasize that Trump is accelerating a trend that did not start with Trump. Now, of course, there are some liberals and Democrats in the U.S. who love to blame everything on Trump. And everything is bad because of Trump. But there are a series of trends we've seen over decades, including de-dollarization, the decline of U.S. hegemony, multipolarization of the world, the global South seeking to create alternative institutions that give the global South, which is the global majority, more influence in international affairs. And the U.S. dominates so many international organizations. So these are trends that did not start with Trump, but I need to emphasize that again. Everything that he's doing with these extremely aggressive attacks on so many countries, including historic U.S. allies, it's only accelerating this trend. That, it's something that you and I, Danny, talk about all the time, the increasingly multipolar world.
Yeah, and react to what Lula said in particular, because he has been leading a huge charge, and he said straight up that Russia and China were the first that he spoke to about his concerns, and both of them were very eager to pick up his call. And he said that BRICS needs to start experimenting with another currency. But we talked about how difficult that is. But at the same time, I think even just moving and putting that move forward is, in effect, a huge challenge.
In the darkened corners of the wall, unspeakable evil waits. A skeptic is found dead in a locked room, his face frozen in fear. Beings with too many limbs vanish into the sky, and a young girl suffers while no one believes until it's too late. This episode will take you through 3 cases that prove our world is stranger and more dangerous than we'd like to believe, because tentacled terrors are everywhere. I'm Josh Pinocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. In 1840, a 20-year-old man named Sir Robert Warboys was sitting inside of a tavern in London's Holborn district, kind of just listening to this group near him tell stories. The stories they were telling about was what they claimed was the most haunted house in all of London. The house, they said, was located at 50 Berkeley Square in the very affluent Mayfair neighborhood. As Robert heard this about these nameless evil entities that haunted this place, he just rolled his eyes. I mean, he was very much a man of science and logic, and he had no time or patience for fairy tales. And in fact, he let everybody in the tavern know exactly what he thought. He's very vocal about it. So He became so insistent that this was all just nonsense and he should stop. And in fact, other pub patrons offered him a challenge. And they said, Robert, if you're so certain that this is just nonsense, why don't you go there and spend the night yourself? Well, Robert, being very young and very eager to prove his point of how brave he was, he immediately accepted. And the arrangements were made for him to spend the night at the most haunted room, which is on the upper floor of the square. Now, a little while later, he arrived, and the landlord met him at the front door, and he looked really nervous. He handed Robert 2 items, a pistol and a bell cord. The cord ran all the way from this room he was going to be in down to the landlord's quarters. And the landlord told Robert that if he encountered anything strange, he should just ring the bell, and the landlord would come money. And right away, Robert became suspicious that there was clearly a lot of fear going on in order to keep him scared. But he's like, you know what, I'll humor him, I'll play along. Of course, he didn't localize this, but he's thinking that. And the landlord then led him up to the room where he'd be spending the night. And there wasn't really a lot of furniture up there, just a small bed and a table. And so he then, the landlord, placed a single candle on the table, lit it, and he quickly left, closing the door. So Robert sat on the edge of the bed, he's all alone, and he's still convinced that this was just all superstitious nonsense, that this would be a very uneventful and boring event. And he then placed his pistol and the candle, and after a while, after nothing happening, and bored and taking his toll, he went to bed about midnight. Fast forward to about 1:45, and
Till he lay down.
the downstairs was startled awake by the frantic ring of the bell coming from Robert's room. I mean, the landlord barely had time to climb out of the bed before he heard the second noise, the sound of a gunshot. And so now the stakes are high. The landlord frantically raises upstairs and bursts into the room with no idea what to expect. And right away, he sees that Robert isn't in bed. He's looking at all the rooms, but Robert isn't cowering. He's dead. In fact, the pistol is still in his hand and it's still smoking from having just been fired. But in the dim candlelight, a landlord finds a single pistol in the wall and he What truly terrifies him is the expression on Robert's face. His lips are peeled back, his teeth are clenched, and his face is just stuck in this final scream of terror. Even his eyes are bulging from their sockets as if he had just seen something so horrifying that he was literally scared to death. Whatever Robert saw or encountered in that room that night had been terrifying enough to make him move